Hello. I'm Nate Crowley from Rock Paper Shotgun, and today I'm going to tell you something, well, something forbidden. Something I was begged not to reveal to you for fear of the potential consequences. But to hell with the consequences. This is something that needs to be shared. This is something that needs to be known. So today I'm going to reveal to you the history of Jason Statham in video games. Now, you might think that there's not much of a history there to reveal, right? Well, that is exactly what Jason Statham wants you to think. It's the only reason PAX greenlit this talk at all, if I'm honest. Because they, like all the rest of us, have been so thoroughly gaslit by years of intense disinformation that they've forgotten. They've forgotten that the vast influence, this elemental force of a man, this living threat whose head resembles an egg crossed with the concept of a fight, has had on the history of gaming. But I remember, and after years of research, constantly pursued, I might add, by the man himself, always staying just one step ahead of him, I finally assembled the proof I need to reveal this to the world and show them all I was right. And I just hope I get to the end of this presentation before he stops me. Because if I say his name enough times, he'll notice, and I've said it a couple of times already, actually. I might as well get it over with. It's Jason Statham, isn't it? He's probably coming for me anyway, so I'll just try and get as much across as I can in the time I've got. And if I seem a bit nervous, well, yeah, I'm bricking it. This isn't a joke. This might seem funny to you, Jason Statham in video games, but it's no laughing matter. Maybe you don't understand the severity of what we're dealing with here, but I have good reason to believe that the Jason Statham we all know, you know, the bald man from the films, well, that's just a pale reflection of his true form. That true form is something else that's existed in some sort of Jungian conceptual space for longer than I dread to think. And more people are aware of that concept, that conceptual Statham, the more powerful the physical version becomes. It's pretty bloody powerful already. I mean, he could punch the head off a skyscraper. Anyway, I think games might be the vessel with which this conceptual Statham may finally break through fully into reality. So by warning you, maybe, I hope to present it. To prevent it, even. Now, before we start, I have been told by the organisers of this event that I must read out a legal notice. So I'm going to do that now. This presentation is entirely a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Apart from Jason Statham, everything about him is completely true. So with the formalities out of the way, let's contextualize. And handily, I've made this brief timeline of all the major things that have ever happened in the history of everything. To really get across to you the idea that while video games might be a recent phenomenon, Jason Statham is anything but. And you'll see by my timeline here that just after the Earth was formed at the start of time, God, the big man himself, had a nightmare about Jason Statham. Really, 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 really scared him. He was going to make humans, but he sort of put it off in case, one of them ended up being him. So he practiced on less threatening things like worms and that, probably fish, the old dinosaurs. I'd like to think maybe he was getting closer to the Stathamic ideal with T-Rex and those lads. Mammos, the old elephants with the hair. Then the dinosaurs died. That's pretty much all I know about the history of the Earth. But then humans came along, and I guess they accomplished some things. But I think that the point to really point out that I've illustrated on this diagram was the release of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. That was a pretty significant event because that heralded humanity's entry into the current epoch of geological time, which is, of course, the Stathamocene. Now, eras of geological time are often named for the dominant sort of form of life in that period, and I don't think there's any questioning that Jason Statham is the dominant form of life on Earth today, as frightening a reality as that is. So we're living under his shadow, really. But what is Jason Statham? Well, I think as I've already alluded to, he's a film man with a chin like a shovel that lifts weights. The shovel, not the chin, although I bet it could. If he tied it to a pulley, he could probably, lift a couple of buses in the air just by sneering. But he's more than just a man with a face that can win fights by itself. He's a concept, like I mentioned earlier. And that concept, as I've also said, dates back to way before any artistic representation of the Stath that you might be familiar with. I've got an image here of, this is an Assyrian sculpture. This is from Sharakin, the fortress of Sargon, which is an archaeological site in present-day Khorzabad. And that was the Assyrian capital in the time of Sargon II. The whole capital was eventually moved 20 kilometers to the south, and the present site was buried. But excavations unearthed this statue of some manner of beast, like a lion, maybe? Because it's got that sort of tail, hasn't it? And wings. And the face of Jason Statham. Now, if that's not a clue that the Assyrians had some idea of who Jason Statham was, I don't know what is. This statue is currently held in the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, or I should say it was held there shortly after I took this photograph. The building was mysteriously called a wanker and kicked into atoms. And we can only imagine who by. But we find representations like this statue all throughout history, echoes in time preceding the arrival of the man himself. And I think it's like Einstein said in his famous quotation, if Jason Statham did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Sorry, I get a bit emotional talking about this. But what does Jason Statham... We've talked about this conceptual Statham, but what is the concept? Well, I suppose a lot of mythological traditions are based around dualities, balance. So in the deity Kali, for example, you have sort of an equilibrium between creation and destruction. In the Abrahamic faiths, God is usually posited in opposition to the devil. Jason Statham just represents fights, really. He's not really in opposition to anything apart from, well, everything. He's quite singular. Whatever he represents, I mean, you don't want to muck around with it, do you? Is what I'm saying. But to get back to the how he's been represented, which I suppose what this lecture is all about, that image of the Assyrian statue is quite interesting, because that representation of Jason Statham as a man with the body of a lion, or a sphinx, as the Egyptians called it, has some interesting heritage. Now let's jump forward now to the 20th century, the very beginning of the 20th century, and the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, who is perhaps best known for his poem The Second Coming, which I'm going to read an excerpt from now. And this was written in 1919 in the terrible turbulence following the First World War. And obviously the society that Yeats was living at the time was quite an anxious one, like the one we live in today. And this is what he had to say. The Second Coming. Hardly are these words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. And that was the birds. I like to do the sound effects. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I'll give you one guess. It's this bloke, Jason Statham. It's interesting. Yeats didn't just mention the Sphinx, but the Spiritus Mundi, which was a spiritual concept. Yeats was something of a mystic, as was the fashion at the beginning of the 20th century. And the Spiritus Mundi, I guess you could see as a sort of a collective imagination, but for mankind, or a shared hallucination, if you wanted to look at it in a different light. And I think if there is such a thing, then Jason Statham has got to be like a hippo in a small lift in that collective imagination of mankind. He absolutely crams it to the edges. And when Yeats was writing just over a century ago, he was still being very much kept at bay from the doors of reality. But that's changed now. Now we're going to jump forward to 1967 for the main body of this lecture. And we're going to look at two things in parallel. We're going to look at the history of Jason Statham, and we're going to look at the history of video games. Because as I said right at the beginning, I think video games, we might think film, but in fact games are the way that Jason Statham is moving from being a primarily conceptual entity to a physical one. I will explain my reasoning. Why have I connected games and Statham so thoroughly? Well, because in a way, the history of Jason Statham is the history of video games. They started at the same moment in time. And how do I know that? Well, In the summer of 1967, television engineer Ralph Baer created the very first primitive games console, and you can see it on the screen now. It was a simple wooden creation, given the rather uncreative name TV Game Unit Mark VII, but it became commonly known to Baer and his associates as the brown box. No clues for guessing why. It's got that retro wood effect veneer on it. And it only had one game on it. Well, it had one main game, which was called Pursuit. A simple affair. 2 dots could chase each other around a screen. Not exactly what you'd call a thrill. This made Pong look positively next gen. But recent examination conducted by myself of a prototype held in the Smithsonian Museum just before it too was sadly kicked into atoms revealed that the brown box had a second game preloaded on it, a hidden one, simply titled He Is Coming. It featured just a blank screen which flashed once when the controls were touched. Now, interestingly, it also deleted itself. I was only able to reverse engineer proof of this game's existence through consultation with some very, very talented software engineers. So this program called He Is Coming was created to do this one thing and be played exactly once. What happened the night that Ralph Baer activated TV Game Unit Mark VII for the first time? On 25th of July, 1967. Yes, that's right. Jason Statham was born. It's a true fact. Look it up. Let's look at that birth in a bit more detail. Jason Statham, as far as we can tell, was born in the UK in the county of Derbyshire. Now, for most people, star sign is a pretty arbitrary thing. It can be fun to talk about, but, you know, I don't think the majority of people think it has a major impact on your life. And it's different for Jason. He was born under the sign of the lion, Leo. And the second he was born, every lion in a 100-mile radius immediately died of anxiety. So they're not really the king of the jungle, are they? That's Jason. And like many spiders or some types of god, Jason was born identical to his current form, but baby-sized. Interestingly, though, whereas babies have a head much larger in proportion to their bodies than adults, it was the other way around for Jason. Tiny little head. And it's carried on expanding over time, and it's still growing. You know, in 100 years, he might just be a massive building-sized head. But right now, he's got normal human proportions. Oh, and he was also born with a gun, which he used to threaten the doctors who delivered him into letting him out of the hospital and giving him a burger. He does need to be nourished, just like any mortal. And shortly after his birth, we start seeing evidence of Jason's intersection with the world of games. So 1972 to 1978, the time we could, I suppose, roughly delineate as Jason's larval stage, was also pretty much the early history of arcade games. Now, it's interesting here. You can see this photograph taken from, I'm not sure what machine this was, actually. But, I mean, you go to any dive bar in the States while arcade machines were taking off, and you'd find most high score boards would have Jason's name at the top. Even though he was a baby in England, he was very good at video games. But yeah, I think that was barely even a hobby for him, because the young Jason was engaged in much more traditionally Stathamic pursuits during his childhood. We don't know much about it, but we know he was into fights, kung fu, kickboxing, just battering people with things. He also helped various members of his family with market stalls. And fun fact, he grew up knowing Vinnie Jones, the fight man off of the football. And Jason was taught football by Vinnie Jones and was actually very good at it, but was sadly forbidden from playing the game after he kicked a foam ball right through a man's chest, which was a bit much on a playground, to be quite honest with you. But this is not fully Jason's biography. It's about games too. So let's return to there and to 1983, where I've identified the beginning of the second period of this strange parallel life of Jason and games. So if you've got a rough familiarity with gaming history, you'll probably know there was a huge crash in the consumer video gaming market in 1983. And there is debate as to whether it was a cause or a symptom, but one of the big events usually pointed to illustrate this crash was the catastrophic failure of the E.T. video game for the Atari, which was famously so bad that every copy was recalled and buried in the desert. But was the game really that bad, or was there another reason? There's two other things happened around that time. One, Jason Statham turned 16. Now, you may remember he was born in Derbyshire, a long way from London. But to fulfill his full conceptual potential, Jason Statham needed to be a Cockney. So on his 16th birthday, he undertook an occult coming-of-age ritual that would turn him into the Cockney he needed to be. So what was the other thing that happened? Well, July the 25th, 1983, the moon of Io, in orbit around Jupiter, did something very strange. And this is absolutely real. You can look it up. Lights were seen flashing on the surface of that distant volcanic moon. And I think it's no coincidence that this happened as Jason Statham turned 16 and the E.T. game is buried in the desert. I'll tell you what happened. E.T. wasn't a film character. He was real. Jason Statham thought he was a complete tosser. So to prove himself worthy of becoming a Cockney, he flew to Io, which is in space, and that's, as everyone knows, E.T.'s house. And he battered him. Strangled him. And then he came back to Earth and said, that game you were going to make about that wrinkly alien, don't bother. He's dead. You're not going to argue with that. So they buried the game, and Jason Statham, now talking in the proper accent you need for whispering threats in pubs, vanished from the Earth. Because now he'd developed the ability to fly through space unaided. I mean, why wouldn't he? Sounds like a great laugh. I imagine he strangled a lot of aliens after that. So next comes a strange patch in Jason's history, because he wasn't on the Earth. We don't know what he was doing. And this period roughly corresponds to the years between 1983 and 1995. So quite a broad gulf of time. And that, I suppose, is the era in gaming where the third generation consoles became very popular and sort of revived the consumer gaming market. And it started with the Famicom, which is, of course, retitled the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. That's very strange, because even though Jason was not on this earth, we have one bit of evidence that suggested he had a presence during this era of gaming. It's this extremely rare screenshot from 1985 Super Mario Brothers, where if you played the game on Jason's birthday and poured a pint of hot lager into the cartridge slot, when you went to the underground bit, instead of da-na-na-na-na, it would play My Old Man's a Dustman, the famous Cockney song, and Jason would appear as a sort of a titanic presence in the background. Chilling. Anyway, that's a footnote, really. We don't know much more about that era, because, like I say, after and around that mysterious incident, Statham was absent from the history of games for a long time. There are many urban legends about his appearance in games during the 80s, but I think really these are all fabrications and artifacts of modern hysteria. Some remember, if one flew far enough away from the area of play in 1985's Helicopter Squad, a huge figure resembling Statham would burst from the sand like one of those snakes off a dune and eat your helicopter. But I think the footage is doctored. And then, of course, there was 1987's Metal Gear Statham, but probably the less said about that, the better. However, this era would come to a close. In 1989, the market for cartridge-based console games was more than $2 billion worth. $2 billion is coincidentally the number of eggs that Jason had consumed by this point in his life at the age of 22. Eggs would never be enough to satiate the man, though. He wanted to fully realize his presence in the world. And remember, I said to do that, he needed more people to be aware of his conceptual reality, to lend his physical strength form. I hope that makes sense. And you have to realize that seeing just what a rampant phenomenon video games were, that had to be too tempting for him to resist as a means of mimetic infiltration of Earth. So he would return. But first, an interesting little tidbit that suggests where he had been. A couple of years ago, the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, received a mysterious signal, which was dismissed by most scientists as, farts bouncing off the moon or whatever they usually explain away these things with. But I got hold of the raw data, and I put it in Photoshop. I came out with this, which is, as far as I can tell, appears to be the box art for an alien video game. And that text I've managed to work out through, let me tell you, a long time of reading books about codes. It's in a very strange language. It translates to battle quadruped. So there's a chilling thing for you. Even wherever he was in space, creatures were making games about Jason Statham. But this battle quadruped would, of course, return to Earth, and that happened in the year 1990. Jason had returned, tempted by the exposure to mass consciousness that was promised by the fourth generation 16-bit consoles, like the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo, but he was still biding his time, yeah? He needed a cover story. So he came up with diving. You may have heard the trivia that Jason Statham was a diver in the 1990 Commonwealth Games. And that's true, but he wasn't really interested in diving into water. He was interested in diving into the minds of men. Now, later that year, we'd see the release of the first gaming product to bear his actual name. Now, that might seem a bit odd, given that he was just a sort of a mid-card, watery sports brute at the time. But it would make sense in retrospect. I am, of course, talking about the game Statham. Now, you don't see many of these around these days, but it was, or at least the bit of it that projected into our reality, was a cartridge featuring a small plastic model of Jason's head that could be affixed to any other console cartridge, or indeed just jammed into any console on its own, in order to make Jason Statham a controllable character in whatever game was being played at the time. Pretty impressive. Now, I think he was testing the waters with that, because let's not forget, no one then knew who Jason Statham was. So I think most of the people who bought this were tired uncles who thought they were buying game genies. But it was a good way of infiltrating the minds of mankind. Because once children had played other games as Jason Statham, they might not have known who he was, but they knew they wanted more of this extraordinarily violent character. And I think once it tested the water with this, later infiltrations were a lot bolder. I am, of course, referring to 1991's Statham the Hedgehog. And its horror is, I think, pretty self-explanatory. And interestingly, Statham the Hedgehog was almost too successful, I would say. You might think you remember Sonic the Hedgehog, but you don't. Jason Statham actually ran around the offices of everyone involved in making Statham the Hedgehog with a knife, waving it at them and forcing them to swear blind it had been about a character called Sonic. There was a massive cartridge recall, and Jason spent a full year kicking those cartridges around an abandoned factory, shouting at them until they agreed that they were actually about a hedgehog. So, he really pulled the wool over our eyes. After Statham the Hedgehog, we get to the second intermediate period, as I like to call it, between 1994 and 1998. Because I think that sudden explosion into consumer culture with the Hedgehog game had been too much too fast. I think Jason realized he needed to try more avenues of approach and do things more subtly, build a firmer hold. So let me take you to the early 90s. And this. It's one of the other trivia you hear about Jason, that as well as being a Commonwealth Games diver, he had appeared as a background dancer in various music videos of the early 90s. And indeed, here he is in the video for Run to the Sun, a song by synth pop duo Erasure. You might think, well, it's just a geezer done up with silver paint, but that wasn't paint. At the time, Jason was undergoing a metamorphosis into an iron body because he thought it might make him more powerful. But he found it was actually disappointingly fragile and weaker than his ordinary form. So he cast it aside and became a being of pure energy for a while. And whereas this was really a gesture with its genesis in flippant rage, the serendipity was quite something, because Jason found that now he was a being of pure energy. He was unconstrained by many of the laws of reality. And this finally gave him the power he needed to really spread himself through game culture. We are trapped on a one-way street in time, ever propelled in one direction towards the grave, but not Jason. I think he developed the ability during that period to exist simultaneously at all points in time as an adult, which is why he appears as modern Statham in every game he featured in, all the way back to 1967. Hell, maybe he created himself by traveling back from the early 90s and appearing in that hospital room. This is a being of such power, we can only theorize. But let's not get too much into that darkness. We are, after all, talking about video games. And so I want to take you to December the 3rd, 1994. Since 1988, Sony and Nintendo had been discussing a joint venture with the being of pure energy, formerly known as Jason Statham, to create a new next-generation console called the PlayStation. And this piece of home electronics was powered by a copy, every single one was powered by an electronically copied version of Jason Statham's soul. However, the prototypes were far too powerful, and Nintendo walked away from the project in fear. The eventual release of the PlayStation came about when Sony panicked and released the devices with a fraction of the power they'd been intended to have, because they'd taken the chips bearing Statham's souls out of them and discarded them. Now, we'll find out what happened to a lot of those. They were mostly bought up by all manner of foolish developers willing to pay any spiritual price to turn a quick profit. And we still have records of some of the games that came about during that period. There was, of course, 1995, where Statham featured as the antagonist in dungeon adventure Stabarinth. And he lurked at the heart of the game's maze with a Stanley knife. And when you got to him, he'd cut you. And then in 1996, we saw the release of Super Statham for the Super Nintendo, where you just hammered the yellow button on the controller to make him run faster and faster towards the screen until you had a heart attack. PC games gave him plenty of airtime too. There was 1997's Inner Statham, which portrayed him as a doctor who treated patients by shrinking himself and beating the crap out of viruses. And then there was 1999's Rubik's Cube with Jason Statham, which offered a fairly straight-laced simulation of the classic puzzle, but where Jason would occasionally help the player by threatening squares into changing colour. Now, you remember I mentioned those chips that had been taken out of the PlayStation? Well, that was also 1999, I think, was the year of the Stathamocene, which is a virtual pet toy containing Jason's soul. And that was visible on screen thanks to an LCD display. And he would be in a state of total apoplexy due to his imprisonment in a plastic egg. That was his actual soul, or an echo of it, and it was extremely cross. These days, it's rumoured that he's trying to track them all down to reabsorb them, those copies of his soul. So if you've got a Stathamagochi, for God's sake, throw it in the sea. He will kick your house to atoms. Now, this proliferation of Statham in games that seemed to be accelerating through the 1990s looked like it could get out of hand. And indeed, if it had carried on at the rate it was going, there probably would be games about nothing but Jason these days. But then came 1998. And this is the beginning of the golden age. Because until this point, Jason had only been present as a physical man and as an idea, and until quite recently in video games. But then he found another means of infiltration into our world, and it all started with this man. This is Guy Ritchie. And in 1998, he was a pretty unremarkable director, and a really big gaming fan. And one Sunday, he was playing a copy of the Statham the Hedgehog sequel, little known, called Statham the Hedgehog and His Enormously Powerful Knuckles. And he engineered a scheme to lure Statham out of the Mega Drive with a wheelbarrow full of meat pies. This worked. Ritchie trapped Statham in a haunted gun, which he then fired at the canister containing the final cut of his film Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. Jason appeared in the film magically as the character Bacon, and the rest is quite literal cinema history. Now, there's a fun fact you ought to know about Jason Statham films I think is crucial here. Jason Statham doesn't actually know that he's appearing in films. He just thinks a camera crew is following him as he goes about his ordinary life. So people will lure him onto a set, out often, as Guy Ritchie learned, with a wheelbarrow full of meat pies, where he will fight a shark, or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, or anything like that, really. None of it phases him, and he just wonders why cameras are following him around. But you can see, looking at this list of Jason Statham's films, that the 2000s were a colossal decade for him. There were loads of them. Well, I can't count, but, that's at least 10, isn't it? Video game fans, of course, were astonished by this. They'd had this figure showing up in games for years, and suddenly, there he was on the screen. Imagine it was like seeing a character from your childhood nightmares show up at work and be introduced as your line manager. Only exciting somehow. And just like he appeared in movies, Jason Statham appeared in many games in the 2000s. There was the FYST series of mystery games, which chronicled his struggle to understand and master the concept of rage while trapped on an enigmatic island. And then there was the marvellous Jason Statham's Art Attack, which featured his mystical quest to climb into every painting in London's National Gallery and fight the occupants. And of course, the 2000s finished with the nightmare that was Crank High Voltage. And have you seen the film? This is an actual screenshot from it. There's a bit where Jason Statham turns into like a massive kaiju monster, which is like a person in like a foam rubber Jason Statham costume and fights a baddie. I'm not even making this up. I'm looking at you with a dead straight face and saying what you're seeing now is a real, well, it's not, it's a production still, but that gurning vision of hell in the center of the screen is in the film. It's mega odd. But anyway, Crank High Voltage actually contains several video game pastiche sequences. And many think this was just a weird stylistic choice, but no, they were Jason Statham's actual memories of being in video games. This leads us to the final epoch of Jason's life, the Mega Golden Age, which lasted from 2009 to the present. Okay, you might say that a Mega Golden Age isn't an established thing, but then you clearly don't know about the existence of Mega Gold, the most brutal of all the elements, which Jason Statham invented. He has a single tooth made of Mega Gold, and it could beat your dad in a fight. Anyway, some of the most recent games featuring Jason have been enormous commercial successes, but you cannot find a single one of them on Steam today. Remember Aliens vs. Statham from 2010, which kickstarted the star's long-running association with Ridley Scott's beloved sci-fi horror franchise? Of course you don't remember it. You probably don't remember 2015 survival horror blockbuster Statham Isolation either, do you? And interestingly, this promo poster reveals a real biological feature of Jason Statham, which is that if he gets angry enough, he screams, and a tiny Jason Statham head comes out of his mouth and screams as well, but slightly more highly pitched. And there have been games in other genres and platforms as well. 2013, we saw the mobile game Flappy Statham, where a small cartoon version of the Punch King himself hurtled through a wilderness of pipes with his arms whirling around to keep him aloft like a sort of a muscly hummingbird. And then there was Jason Statham's VR Tarot in 2016. It was a fortune-telling sim where every card bore his face and prompted a terrifying chase sequence. And controversially, there was... do you remember the StathNav? Which is a seemingly harmless navigation app for drivers. But in the summer of 2017, it began coding riddles in Statham's voice and steering people's cars into ditches if they couldn't answer quickly enough. People never answered quickly enough. A lot of cars ended up in flames in ditches. And the films continued too. There was the Expendables franchise, Romeo and Juliet. Spy, of course, which Jason made after learning to tell jokes. And then, of course, there was The Meg, which is about an ancient, near unkillable monster thought long extinct, and a big shark. It carries on. Just last year, we saw the release of the Hobbs and Shaw visual novel. It's a touching choice-based narrative about the rivalry between Jason Statham and The Rock. But I fear that we got more than we bargained for with that game and the film that was based on it. Because I think it was a mistake to introduce Jason Statham to The Rock and Idris Elba, who are both very, powerful men in their own rights. I think they formed an unholy alliance. And this is the reason why everything that I've mentioned so far in this lecture has been removed from the record of history. Indeed, I think there are no traces of Statham-based games media left outside of the images in this presentation, which is why it's so vital that I've given you this information today. What's left then on Wikipedia? If you look for games involving Jason Statham, 2002's Red Faction 2, 2003's Call of Duty, where he played Sergeant Waters apparently, and 2015's Sniper X with Jason Statham, a mobile game which sounds blatantly made up. Yeah, sounds like a cover story for me. But now you know the true history. And that's a power, but it's also a burden, because now you're in danger. So now you know the truth. But while that's a great power, that's also a terrible burden, because Jason does not want this stuff known. And now you too are in the same danger that I am in. We're the custodians of a terrible secret. That video games may represent the route by which a full Stathamic incursion into physical reality may yet occur. Don't despair, though, because I believe it can be averted. And that's the really crucial part of this, which I'm going to tell you now. Oh, hold. Sorry. That's really embarrassing. I should turn my phone. That's weird. I recognise that number. 0779JASON. I'm sorry. I fear I must take this.
Where are you?
Nowhere in particular. Nowhere you can find me. Love, get the car started. Pack what you can. We need to leave.
Save the fuel. Coming for you.
Please, Jason. Please. It was honest research. The world needed to know.
I'll be there in 5.
No. No, please. Spare me, Jason. I'll do anything.
I'll be there in 5 seconds.
You order room service?
Jason. Jason. That's a rusty bread knife you're holding.
I look like I'd carry a pencil.
Why are you offering that knife to me, Jason?
5 seconds to remove your hand.
What do you mean you'll give me 5 seconds to remove my hand?
And I'll give you 5 seconds to remove your hand. Do you remember that?
No. I can't. Not... Please, I need my hands for the computer games.
Well, there's a first time for everything.
All right, but it's just I'm trying to do a presentation here, mate.
You don't want to do this.
Well, of course I don't want to cut off my own hands, but if that's the sacrifice I need to make, then well, so be it. Give me the knife.
And I pronounce you man a knife.
Thank you for attending today's lecture. There will be no opportunity for questions.